The US and China are reportedly planning to hold talks next week to address nuclear arms control, marking the first such dialogue since the Obama administration. According to the Wall Street Journal, discussions are set to focus on ways to reduce nuclear miscalculation at a time of elevated risks. Now, this, however, is not an initiation of formal negotiations to cap each side's nuclear arsenals, a process that Washington has historically undertaken with Moscow. Instead, it would allow U.S. officials to question Beijing about its nuclear policy. Now, China has maintained a smaller nuclear arsenal compared to the U.S. and Russia for many years. The reports say it is being expanded. Beijing is set to possess more than 500 operational nuclear warheads as of May, and this number is expected to double by the end of the decade. China signed the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty during the Clinton administration. However, during the Trump administration, it rejected talks with the U.S. and Russia on an arms cap, citing its relatively smaller nuclear arsenal. Monday's nuclear arms talks between the two powers comes ahead of an anticipated meeting between both nations' presidents at the APEC summit in San Francisco later this month. Now, the two leaders have not met in person since their last encounter at the Group of 20 gathering in Indonesia nearly a year ago. Now, for more on this, we're now joined by Dr. Benjamin Zala. He is Fellow International Relations at Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at ANU. Dr. Zala, welcome to the program. Now, arms control and non-proliferation, they have been among the thorniest of topics between the U.S. and China. But I want to talk about the timing of these talks. It is the first such talks with Beijing since the Obama administration. So we are looking at about a decade gap here. Why has it taken so long for these talks to resume?
Well, it's really taken so long because the two sides here, the US and China, are on completely different pages when it comes to the need to reduce nuclear risks, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. The US sees the buildup that China's undertaking and is extremely concerned about this because they are extrapolating intentions from that, saying, look, China's building up its nuclear arsenal. They must have some sort of aggressive or nefarious intent. China, on the other hand, says we're expanding our arsenal because we have to, because our arsenal is vulnerable, particularly compared to the United States. And as US capabilities have become more precise and have become better in terms of targeting and in terms of remote sensing, in terms of being able to find an adversary's nuclear forces, that makes the Chinese very nervous. And effectively what they're trying to do is make themselves a harder target to hit, a harder target to attack. And so they're expanding the size of that arsenal. So the two of them see this from completely opposite directions. And there's really been no common ground and really very little incentive for either side, therefore, to engage in direct talks.
So it's reported that China is likely to field more than 1,000 warheads by the year 2030. But why should the U.S. be concerned since its nuclear stockpile is still a lot more than Beijing?
Well, that's right. The US stockpile is about 10 times larger than the Chinese stockpile. So the short answer is the United States doesn't really need to be concerned about China's build-up in an immediate sense. There really is no direct threat being posed to the United States by even a modest increase. And those numbers, of course, the reported build-ups are actually predictions made by the US Department of Defense. So this isn't a sort of a neutral, objective observer. This is predictions coming from the US military. And those predictions from the US military have been wrong on many occasions in the past. But we can see that China is certainly building up its arsenal to some extent. We just don't know to exactly what size. The reason it may, in principle, become a problem for the United States is whilst the US has had about the same size arsenal as Russia for most of the Cold War and for many decades now, that means that the US and Russia were able to deter an attack on each other by being able to promise a retaliation, a punishment, if one side attacked first. If the US feels that it has to deter both Russia and China, the US may feel that it actually needs to expand its arsenal. Now, it doesn't necessarily, because all the US really needs to be able to do is promise some kind of retaliation that would be unacceptable to either side. And the US has more than enough weapons to be able to do that. But if the US is planning on being able to target the actual forces of both China and Russia at the same time, that will be very, very difficult, if not impossible to do, if both Russia and China have arsenals the same size as the US. Just the mathematics of it incentivise the Americans to build up their arsenal to an even larger number. And my sense is they want to try and avoid that, and they want to try and find some way of encouraging China to accept some sort of limits on its arsenal, putting some caps on it.
So on the other hand, Russia a week ago said it is not concerned over China's buildup as it develops its own. How does that impact negotiations on any potential arms control treaty involving the three parties going forward?
Look, the impact of a build-up of the Chinese arsenal, and let's assume that the US estimates, the US Department of Defense's estimates, are roughly correct. And what China's looking to do is increase to about the same size as the Russian and American nuclear arsenals to achieve what we call parity between all three of them. If that's correct, that's really only a problem for any of them if they have what we call a counterforce strategy. And that's a strategy to target the actual forces of the other side. If instead you have what's known as a counter-value strategy, which is that you promise a retaliation against, civilian targets, even cities, as morally abhorrent as that might sound, that actually isn't a problem. Because all you're saying to the other side is, if you attack us first with whatever weapons we have left over, we will cause such damage and destruction on your city that we are going to deter you from doing so. We're going to target even a few of your cities will be enough to deter you from taking that first step. So that's why the Russians aren't concerned, and that's why many argue that the Americans actually don't need to necessarily be concerned by this. So in terms of what can come out of these talks, it doesn't necessarily have to be some sort of quantitative reduction. It doesn't necessarily have to be some limit that all three sides, Russia, the United States and China, will all agree to. It might be some other kinds of reductions, or at least some kinds of confidence-building measures between the parties in which they give each other confidence that none of them are planning to attack first, that they can at least have the confidence that they are not going to be subject to a preemptive first strike.
Okay, and we are in a period of nuclear instability. You know, we are looking at a three-way arms race with the US, Beijing and Moscow, and that is intensifying. Will this have a detrimental effect, though, such as in pushing more countries to acquire their own?
It may do, but not necessarily in the short term. An arms race between these states doesn't necessarily incentivise other states to arm themselves. But what it does do is incentivise other already nuclear armed states to build up their arsenals. So, yes, you're right, there is a sort of a three-way arms race, if not underway, at least looking to be underway in the coming years between the United States, Russia and China. But we have to remember that what happens in China will also affect India, because India worries about the Chinese nuclear arsenal. And of course, whatever India does will affect Pakistan. So there is actually a very complex chain of relationships here that are very hard to untangle. And so it won't just be a three-way arms race. It's going to be much wider than that. And that raises all sorts of issues for stability. Effectively, if states are building up their arsenals, that means they're nervous about being subject to a first attack, to a first strike. That's not a good thing when it comes to crises in the Asia-Pacific region. You don't want nuclear-armed states being nervous about having to maybe attack first, lest they get attacked by someone else. This is what we call a use-it-or-lose-it situation. You don't want states feeling that they're backed into a corner and that they have to use their nuclear weapons first before they get wiped out in a preemptive strike by someone else. And that's where those really dangerous moments of miscalculation and misperception can lead to a rapid escalation of a crisis. And that's hopefully what these kind of talks between the US and China, and if talks can ever resume again between the US and Russia and so forth, these are the sorts of things that these talks can try and diffuse a little bit, and to try and build some degree of mutual understanding between each side about how they understand what their arsenals are for, and if they're just being used for deterrence purposes, they're not planning to fight wars and win wars using their nuclear weapons. They can start to lower those risks of nuclear escalation.
Dr. Zala, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us. That was Dr. Benjamin Zala, Fellow International Relations at Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at ANU.